in the tech world, this perceived hierarchy between front-end and back-end engineering, there's this lingering idea, isn't there, that back-end is the real, like, meat and potatoes.
Heavy lifting.
Exactly, the complex logic, all that. And front-end is somehow, well, maybe less critical, maybe just making things look pretty.
It's definitely a perception that persists. And, as our stack of sources shows, it often just completely overlooks the deep, distinct challenges involved in building the interfaces and the client-side experiences we all use every single day.
You are listening to Merge Conflicts Real Dev Talk, where passionate developers tackle code, culture, and everything in between.
The very first thing they tackle, like head-on, is that core myth we mentioned.
Yeah.
Back-end is real engineering.
And front-end, maybe not so much.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and the counter-argument they make, quite forcefully, I'd say, is that front-end development isn't just comparably challenging, but in many ways it's fundamentally more unpredictable. And it requires this uniquely broad spectrum of skills compared to perhaps traditional back-end work.
This is where they bring up a concept one source actually calls the myth of the controlled environment. They sort of paint the back-end world as often operating within relatively known, stable setups. Your server specs, your network configuration between services, pretty predictable.
Whereas the front-end world, they argue, is basically defined by chaos. And the sources list some, well, pretty compelling reasons why they use that specific word.
Okay, like what?
Well, one of the big ones is device diversity. Think about it. As a front-end developer, you're not building for just one target.
Right.
You're building for everything. Tiny smartwatch screens, massive ultra-wide monitors, low-power phones from 5 years back, the latest flagships, different resolutions, orientations.
And every single one behaves slightly differently, has its own quirks.
Exactly. Then you've got the browser battlefield. Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, maybe others too. While we have standards, each browser interprets them, well, imperfectly. They have their own little quirks.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that.
The sources point out that code working perfectly in one browser can just mysteriously break in another because of these subtle differences that are completely outside the developer's control.
And network uncertainty, that's huge too, right? Back-end systems, they often talk over these really reliable data center networks.
Stable.
But front-end code, it has to work if you're on super fast fiber or struggling with airport Wi-Fi or bouncing down the road on a bus with, like, flaky 3G.
Yeah. Your carefully written code can just fail purely because the network connection drops or it's unreliable. It just adds this whole layer of unpredictable failure points.
Wow.
And sources put a really strong emphasis on accessibility imperatives. Building for users with different abilities, screen readers, keyboard navigation, other assistive tech. It isn't just like a nice to have.
No, it's essential.
Often legal, right. Exactly. It's often a non-negotiable requirement, sometimes with legal implications. And this forces front-end developers to think about interaction and structure in these deeply complex ways that, frankly, most back-end developers don't have to consider directly.
That leads right into something one piece calls the persistence problem, which makes sense. Unlike back-end fixes, which you deploy to a relatively stable server environment.
Front-end code lives on the user's device. So a browser update, an OS patch, some new hardware hitting the market, any of these things can break perfectly functional front-end code, like overnight.
So the job isn't just building it once.
No way. It means the work isn't just about building, it's about constant vigilance, right? Continuous testing across that always expanding matrix of environments and frequent updates just to keep things from breaking because of external changes you didn't even make.
And finally, there's this idea of visibility and vulnerability. Back-end errors often live kind of privately, right? In server logs, monitoring dashboards.
Yeah, you could often detect and fix them in controlled settings, maybe before users even notice anything's wrong.
But front-end errors,
they happen right there, right in front of the user.
Yeah.
A button doesn't work, the layout's completely messed up, content is missing.
super frustrating for the user.
Totally. And they can be incredibly frustrating to debug, too, because trying to reproduce that exact combination of device, browser, OS, network condition, it can be a nightmare. That public visibility plus the difficulty reproducing it, it adds this unique kind of pressure.
What I found particularly interesting is how the sources move beyond just the let's say, purely technical stuff.
Hmm.
They highlight this significant human element in front-end work that back-end, well, generally doesn't grapple with quite so directly.
Exactly. Backend often focuses on system efficiency, data integrity, logical processes, machines talking to machines in a way.
Right.
Front end has to translate all that underlying complexity into an experience that actually makes sense to a human being. Someone who doesn't care how the database is sharded or how the API is versioned.
And that requires a whole different set of skills. We're talking user experience design, understanding how people think, how they navigate interfaces, how to make these complex workflows feel intuitive, simple even.
Performance psychology, too. Understanding how users perceive speed and responsiveness, which isn't always just about raw milliseconds, right? A well-designed loading animation might feel faster than just a blank screen, even if the back end takes a tiny bit longer.
We mentioned accessibility expertise already, which is obviously huge, knowing how to make interfaces genuinely usable for everyone.
And even cross-cultural design. Understanding that users in different parts of the world might read differently, have different visual expectations, or interact with technology in culturally specific ways. That's another layer.
The sources describe this concept, I thought this was neat, called invisible excellence.
Yeah, I like that one.
The idea is that the very best front-end work is often invisible. It's so smooth, so intuitive, you don't even notice it. Users only notice when it's not good, when things break or are confusing.
Which means the complex decisions, the sheer amount of work needed to make something feel simple. It often goes completely unseen and unappreciated.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it seems, based on these materials, that this reality is maybe starting to sink in more widely. One source included what they called voices from the trenches, quoting developers. I found it fascinating. There was one back-end dev who admitted reading about front-end challenges was genuinely enlightening, made them realize how much they had underestimated it.
Huh. And another veteran apparently just stated flatly something like, front-end complexity is exactly this challenging, just validating the perspective.
Yeah. And there was that particularly vivid quote from a back-end person saying, front-end is enough to give me nightmares.
Wow.
That really captures that unique kind of anxiety, I think, that comes with build for environments you just can't fully predict or control.
Okay, so the sources make a really strong case for front-end complexity, but they don't stop there, right? They also present the back-end counter-arguments, forcefully pushing back against the idea that back-end is simple or that its environment is always this quiet room.
Definitely. These voices argue really strongly that saying back-end is just simple CR day,
Yeah.
create, read, update, delete is just a massive oversimplification. They highlight this extensive list of responsibilities that really define modern back-end development.
Okay, like what kind of things?
Well, things like building and maintaining complex integrations with tons of external business partners, capacity planning for data and user growth that can scale exponentially, navigating and implementing really stringent compliance requirements, and constant security audits.
Okay, yeah, that doesn't sound simple.
Not at all. Plus dealing with complex data governance policies, maintaining strict service level agreements, SLAs, with critical third-party services, migrating off ancient legacy systems without anyone noticing, hopefully.
Zero downtime migrations, yeah. Tricky.
Very tricky. And building API version strategies that ensure your new features don't just break every existing client out there.
The point these sources really drive home is that backend isn't just writing logic. It's building and maintaining the core, like, nervous system and infrastructure that keeps entire businesses running around the clock.
And they argue that backend developers are often expected to handle way more than just backend code. The material mentions things like managing client requirements, coordinating with QA, setting up and maintaining deployment pipelines, writing comprehensive documentation.
Building and monitoring alerting systems, deep performance optimization, security vulnerability assessments.
And yes, often getting pulled into debugging front-end issues that are initially, and sometimes maybe incorrectly, blamed on a back-end API.
I can see that happening.
And as the sources put it, these are the people getting those dreaded 3 a.m. calls when production systems go down. They need this deep systemic understanding of the entire stack. They often end up acting as de facto DevOps engineers, database experts, and system architects all rolled into one.
And here's a really sharp counter-argument that the back-end proponents in the sources raise. They argue that sometimes pushing complexity to the front end actually creates more problems than it solves.
How so?
Well, because, as they see it, the server-side backend is the place where you can have control. You generally have better performance characteristics, your business logic is centralized and reliable, and you can implement proper error handling and security measures much more effectively.
Okay.
Pushing critical logic or complex state management out to the client means you inherit all those front-end chaos factors we talked about, browser differences, unreliable networks, client-side security vulnerabilities, and there's just no guarantee that your critical logic will even execute correctly in every single user environment.
Right. You lose that control.
Exactly. The back end, they argue, is where you can actually guarantee data consistency, enforce complex validation rules reliably, and maintain secure, dependable audit trails.
That's a fair point. So while front-end deals with the chaos of the user environment, back-end is dealing with a different kind of deep, systemic, maybe more controlled, but still incredibly complex challenge.
Precisely. Which brings us to another huge area of back-end complexity highlighted in the sources: scaling, production fires, and distributed system complexity. This is where that idea of back-end being quiet truly evaporates.
Yeah, I can imagine. An application might work just fine in development, maybe with a few users. But the sources stress that real growth brings exponential challenges. Performance degrades unexpectedly, memory leaks suddenly appear, database deadlocks can cripple systems.
And tiny issues that were invisible before can suddenly cascade into major outages under heavy load.
And this forces major architectural changes, right? You're suddenly deep into things like implementing complex caching layers, maybe sharding massive databases, splitting them up to handle more load.
Setting up load balancing, implementing things like circuit breakers to prevent cascading failures. Concepts like horizontal scaling become absolutely essential.
And debugging issues that only appear under heavy production load. That's a specific kind of nightmare, according to these sources. Very hard to reproduce.
The reality of modern enterprise backend systems, as they're described, is that they are distributed, often across multiple services, different data centers, maybe multiple cloud environments. They are, to quote one source, never quiet.
Never quiet, I like that.
Yeah. There are constant low-level failures happening. Network partitions between services, individual services degrading slightly, cascading failures when one critical dependency goes down.
And the sources really emphasize the sheer complexity of maintaining data consistency and reliable workflows across all these distributed services. They talk about using message queues, event streaming platforms, things like Saga patterns.
Which are ways to manage complex multi-step transactions across different services, right? So if one step fails, you can reliably undo or compensate for the previous steps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This world, they say, is where you're constantly wrestling with eventual consistency. This idea that data might not be instantly identical across all parts of the system while still trying to provide a reliable user experience.
Sounds challenging.
One source summed it up perfectly. The back end is where Murphy's Law lives and breathes. If it can go wrong, it probably will, especially at scale.
So that supposed quiet room is actually more like a war room, constantly reacting to and mitigating problems. Production fires, cascading failures, maybe database corruptions, security breaches, performance bottlenecks under unexpected load, integration nightmares with systems you don't even control.
All while still trying to deliver new features on schedule.
Yeah, and the sources make a really critical point about the impact and the level of responsibility here. A back-end failure can genuinely halt business operations. It can lose critical data, expose sensitive information, cost the company millions in downtime.
And genuinely put people's jobs on the line. The stakes are often incredibly high.
Whereas a front-end bug, while annoying for the user, might result in a poor UX or maybe a broken visual element. It rarely has that same immediate, potentially catastrophic business impact that a major back-end failure can have.
Right. Front-end fixes can often wait for the next release cycle, maybe. Back-end production fires require immediate, high-pressure, often all-hands-on-deck resolution. Now.
So the high-level back-end complexity involves, well, deep knowledge of distributed systems theory, complex state management across all these disparate services, orchestrating massive data pipelines, handling real-time processing, implementing advanced caching strategies, rigorous security hardening across multiple layers.
Multi-dimensional performance optimization, and just maintaining reliability under extreme pressure, all while continuously shipping new features. The sources argue the cognitive load here is just immense, and it's fundamentally different from the challenges faced on the front end.
Okay, so bringing all these compelling arguments together, the sources offer a really powerful synthesis. The core message they seem to land on is that framing this whole thing as a hierarchy is just the wrong approach. It's not about one being more real or inherently harder than the other.
It's about different types of complexity, different kinds of problem solving.
Exactly. They reiterate the distinct but equally vital goals. Backend builds the robust, scalable, secure systems that manage data and business logic. Frontend translates those complex systems into intuitive, accessible, and responsive experiences that work for actual people across countless devices and situations.
And the clear unifying conclusion from this stack of sources seems to be simply, both are engineering, both are complex, and both are absolutely essential for modern software.
The sources also strongly emphasize what they call the integration imperative. Modern software isn't really a battleground between front-end and back-end. Successful applications require both sides to work together seamlessly, in what one source described as perfect harmony.
Yeah, because as a user, you don't experience the front end or the back end separately, do you? You just experience one application.
Right. A slow API response is just as much a problem for the user experience as a broken button is, regardless of which team is technically responsible for fixing it.
Which leads to a really fundamental point these sources make about redefining engineering itself. Real engineering, they argue, isn't defined by where the code runs or whether it talks directly to a database.
It's defined by solving complex problems under significant constraints. Debugging why a layout breaks only on a specific, obscure browser version is an engineering problem, just like optimizing a database query under heavy load is an engineering problem.
The specific challenges are different, sure. The skill sets required are distinct, but the core work, analyzing problems, designing solutions, implementing systems, iterating, ensuring reliability, that fundamental process is the same.
Looking ahead, the sources suggest it's really time to retire this outdated notion of real versus, lesser engineering. Modern front-end development has evolved dramatically in complexity.
Absolutely. The future of software development, they argue, lies in recognizing the unique, indispensable value of each discipline and fostering deep collaboration, not maintaining some kind of perceived hierarchy.
This whole dive into the sources, it really makes you think, doesn't it? They raise some pretty sharp questions along the way.
Yeah, like, is complexity best measured by deep technical depth within a controlled system? Or is it better measured by the sheer number of uncontrolled variables you have to constantly account for? That's an interesting one.
Or how about this one, which is inherently harder? Solving problems where maybe only other engineers see your work and can appreciate the technical elegance, or solving problems where every single user immediately sees your mistakes.
Ooh, that's a good one too. The visibility factor again.
And the sources also make you wonder, has that perception gap between front-end and back-end actually narrowed at all in the industry, especially as front-end tech and the demands on it have grown so much more sophisticated recently?
That's a key question. And what are the implications of these attitudes, these perceptions, on actual team dynamics, on collaboration, and maybe even on the industry's increasing expectation for engineers to somehow be full stack and master both equally well?
Right. Lots to think about there.
So, wrapping up our deep dive today, I think the core message from this stack of sources is pretty compelling and clear. Both front-end and back-end development involve immense but distinct challenges. Each requires sophisticated skills, deep knowledge, and really rigorous problem solving.
Yeah, neither is inherently more real engineering than the other. They're just two sides of the same incredibly complex coin, both absolutely essential for building the seamless functional applications we rely on every single day.
So, as you navigate the digital world today, maybe take a moment to consider the incredible hidden complexity on both sides. Think about the robust, distributed systems humming unseen on servers across the globe.
And also the painstakingly crafted interfaces, designed to feel effortlessly intuitive and work flawlessly across that unpredictable universe of devices and browsers we talked about.
Yeah. What does this understanding change about how you perceive the technology you use every day, and maybe how you see the diverse skills of all the engineers who build it?